Good afternoon, everyone. I'm In-Sung Kim from Political Science, and this is a joint project with Jörn Dunkel, who's sitting right there, from Mathematics Department. So our project is titled tentatively as the Mathematics of Lawmaking in the United States, and we are hoping to share some of preliminary results that we have with you guys, and hopefully you'll see something very interesting about the lawmaking in the United States. Special interest groups engage in lobbying to influence the legislative process in the United States. There are actually more than 12,000 bills that are introduced in each congressional session. 12,000 bills. It's not only Obama healthcare bill or Trump tax bill or IRA kind of bill that we all know, but there are also other so-called micro bills where special interest groups are lobbying to affect the legislative politics at the very, very granular level. We know, based on our data collection effort, that most of these bills are actually lobbied. And then we collect our data according to the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995, which legally requires all the interest groups to report their lobbying activities. And one of those lobbying activities include which type of the legislative bills that they have lobbied on. And this is a great opportunity for researchers like us to systematically measure the competing interest in the legislative politics, which we all agree probably will be very, very important. However, there exists very few empirical studies that examine who supports or who opposes which bill, whether supporters and opponents dominate at different stages of the legislative process, and or which political actors are more or less successful in advancing their legislative goals. These are all very, very important questions to ask and answer, but very few empirical studies exist. So my question to you all is why? Given what's happening in Washington, D.C. these days, I guess that we all want to understand this. And there's a vast literature in the field of political science or computational social science in general that have examined interest group politics in Washington, D.C. for a long, long period of time. But from empirical perspective, there are literally no studies, arguably, to systematically study these at a large scale. You can see a journalistic coverage of one of those questions every now and then. But we are talking about systematic, extensive study of the entire legislative bills, for example, that are being considered in Washington, D.C. So the answer to this question is that it is extremely hard to identify which bills interest groups lobby. Even when we can find who lobbies on which bill, interest groups are not legally required to disclose whether they have supported or opposed the bills. So despite the significance of these questions, it's very difficult, and therefore few studies exist to examine these questions. So in this project, we are trying to overcome these challenges. The agenda for today's talk is to just visually show the data that we have collected so far, and motivate the importance of studying the interest group positions based on the signals that we have observed, and then show you just a simple descriptive stat regarding the unequal representation in the US lawmaking, so that we can all think together about the importance of the representation in democracy. So this is actual data that we have collected during last 15 years. Based on the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995, you have the federal filings that specifies which clients in the first column. That is, you can think of this as Apple, the company, interest group, and then registrants who represent the client, Apple. In this case, the K Street lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. You also know the identities of individual lobbyists who have been hired by these law firms to represent the interests of the client, Apple. You also have a measurement of how these lobbyists are linked to different government agencies like FDA for pharmaceutical industry or SEC for financial industries and so forth, in terms of whether a lobbyist has any revolving door connections or experiences in those agencies. We also have a measurement of the connection, political connections between the lobbyist and the legislators at a very, very granular level. So if a lobbyist has ever worked as an intern for a Senator A for 3 months, then we observe that. So you can imagine extremely granular measurements of the political network and very high dimensional data that we need to analyze. The Lobbying Disclosure Act and then the derivative database that we have created, LobbyView, actually captures a lot of interesting signals. And this is just a visualization of what's happening. We're not going to read all of this, but I want to draw your attention to this part. For example, when there was a 911, you see a lot of lobbying spike represented by this dark shaded red cell involving aviation and airlines. Okay? So this is just the predictive validation, if you will, where we are actually capturing something very meaningful in terms of what's going on in Washington, D.C. in terms of the issue area. On the right-hand side, you can also see differences across the different administration. So you see the first Trump is associated with a lot of lobbying happening regarding U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Okay? And then you see that by gathering this high-dimensional data, you can actually map not only what's going on in Washington, D.C., but also map the political communities, if you will, that are driving the lawmaking in Washington, D.C. I'm going to move on to measurements of interest group politics. So we know what's going on. We know who's lobbying on which bill, but we want to know whether certain interest groups are taking particular positions toward particular legislative bills. So to that end, we are also creating a new data set for lobbied bills and committees. Here is an example of what's actually being reported in lobbying report. You can see that interest group lobbied on HR 83, which is a House Bill 83. So what we are doing is by automatically parsing through the universe of the lobbying reports filed by all interest groups to identify which interest groups have lobbied on which bill. You may think that it's very easy to extract out this information, but this is one of the difficulty of it is one of the reasons why we spent last 15 years to even create this data set. You can see this HR 83 being a bill from House of Representatives, but there are 110th Congress HR 83, 111th Congress HR 83. So just because you observe HR 83 doesn't necessarily mean that you can correctly identify the bill. Therefore, in this case, it's very important to compare and contrast the bill number and bill title, and so that we can correctly map this HR 83 to 113th Congress bill. And of course, we do more sophisticated algorithmic approaches for measurements, such as in this case, Affordable Care Act, with no bill number listed. We're going to look at the text distances between what we have observed here with the universe of the bill titles database to be able to correctly identify the bill number as well as the title. So we consider over 108,000 congressional bills introduced since 106 Congress. For each one of those lobbying activities, we identify the lobbying activities based on over 1 million lobbying report. And we then link these reports and the instance of the lobbying to committees that consider each bill, and also the individuals who are serving in the congressional committees to consider this bill, which will then be used to create the high-dimensional network data that I presented earlier. So once you have the measurement of which bill is lobbied by which interest group, now the next step is to see the positional measurement. So let's look at the top part. The lobbying report actually reads endorsement of the Hidden Figures Congressional Gold Medal Act. So in this case, we know that this is in support of passing this bill. On the other hand, another case where defeat S23, the Senate Bill number 23, and HR 1249, which is a clear indication that the interest group is opposing the bill. Right? Of course, not all the time we observe this. So what we do is to manually measure this type of the leanings, opposition or support of the bill. And then we use a large language model to go through each individual text to have its own measurements of the support, oppose, etc. And then we can then compare the performance of the large language model to tune its performance to have a proper measurement of the support, oppose. For those on the bottom side, for those where we do not have any textual information about the position of the bill, what we utilize is analyzing the systematic pattern revolving around the bill level lobbying. So in this case, we know that this particular interest group has lobbied on this bill based on the earlier measurement strategy. But we do not know whether it has lobbied for or against, even when we were able to measure for some of them. So what we then do is, let's look at the history of the lobbying activities, and then involve the lobbyists and the lobbying companies, and then history of the position taking that we have learned from this upper part. So the idea is that if A and B are lobbied on similar bills in the history, and we know that they have taken a similar position, and then now we have a measurement of A's position toward the bill, let's say support, but we do not observe B's position toward the bill, but it's reasonable to, at that point, respect that B might have also shared a similar type of the position toward the bill. And that's how we utilize this high-dimensional network data to be able to predict the positional leaning of each individual interest groups, even when they do not disclose their positions. So once you do that, then some interesting patterns will emerge. What we found is that upper part is the enacted bills in Washington, D.C. We see that there is an uptake here in this purple, which captures the monitoring activities. So we see that a lot of interest groups start monitoring the implementation of the passed bill. So it is not only that you are lobbying to affect the bill making, but also how you are going to affect the implementation of a public law once it is enacted. You also see on this bottom figure that once the bill has been passed on the floor, before presidential action, like a veto, for example, you see an uptake in opposition. So you see that interest groups that are trying to block the bill start collectively gathering together to mobilize to oppose the passing of the bill. This, we believe, is a very important finding. In fact, that what we are trying to do is to characterize this high-dimensional data as a function of multiple conditional probabilities from mathematical modeling perspective. And one of the conditional probabilities is to see whether firm size is related to the lobbying activities. What we find is that, not surprisingly, larger firms, but the positive on the right-hand side of this vertical line means that larger firms are positively associated with this activity. So we see that larger firms are positively associated with the lobbying activities. So larger firms tend to lobby more. But what we found here is that smaller firms are more likely to oppose. So this suggests that in the legislative process, big firms are lobbying to influence the agenda setting and introduce a lot of bills. But it is the small interest groups, very small actors, that tend to be very reactive by start opposing in the later stage of the legislative process. So this bottom part is one of the first times that actually social scientists will be able to look at the differences in the political activities as a function of the firm size. Finally, I just want to share with you a brief descriptive stat on the unequal representation in the US lawmaking. So this is a lobbying report, again, another example of lobbying report. And I told you that in lobbying report, we actually observed all the lobbyists who got involved in lobbying this particular activity. The lobbyists are listed by name on filing, but we know very little about who they are. So what we did was went to the webpage of this particular K Street lobbying firm and then tried to find who these persons are, and then sort of put the pictures of each individual lobbyist involved in this particular lobbying activities, which is representing Dow Chemical Company. It's a chemical multinational company. Do you see any pattern from these pictures? Yes, major lobbying firms tend to hire overwhelmingly larger number of white male lobbyists. So what we have done is to standardize and deduplicate based on the all various name identifier, try to identify each individual federally registered lobbyist to learn about the composition of the lobbyists in terms of their racial and gender distribution. Of course, this has been very, very difficult, and even when you're using cutting-edge algorithms, sometimes the measurements is not quite correct. So what we're doing is to find each individual lobbyist in the LinkedIn data, and then connect their information, the name information, with their education, gender, ethnicity, and then history of their employment, and so forth. So we have a very, very granular measurement of them. But just to show a simple stat, you see on the left-hand side, this is the distribution over racial groups, and the light blue represents the population proportion, and then dark blue represents the actual distribution in the lobbying industry. So against the population distribution for the white, you can see that overwhelmingly larger number of the Washington, D.C. lobbyists are actually white. And that unequal representation becomes even more severe if we weight that based on experience in lobbying. That is, how long the lobbyists have worked in the Washington, D.C. So what we learned is that the senior lobbyists are even more disproportionately represented by white male. So this is just the descriptive stats that I've shared, and hopefully this gives you an idea about what we are working on. I look forward to Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much, In-sung. Questions?
Hi. To add even more confusion, one thing that goes on in Congress is that sometimes the representatives trade their votes. They'll say, you vote for this bill, I'll vote for that bill. So, it could be that a lobbyist convince a senator or representative to vote for a bill, but then they trade away that vote, on something else, or because of party machinations. So does that also throw you off?
Yes, that's definitely very, very important. First of all, people weren't able to even measure whether it's a for or against, so we are moving forward in that regard. Regarding the for, against, and change of the positions as a result of the lobbying, one of the good ways to look at is the history of the legislative bills. So there are 12,000 bills that are introduced in Congress, as I mentioned, but only a few hundreds are actually voted on the floor. So what happens to all these other 12,000 bills that have been introduced? It turned out that a lot of those so-called micro bills, the text within those bills are cut and pasted onto the later so-called omnibus bills to reflect this lowering behavior. Basically, I support this bill, not that bill. But if you agree to include the text from this bill that I support in the later bill, that I might support this bill. So given that we can actually look at the history of the bills, and then the positional taking of not only the interest groups and associated politicians, we'll be able to actually answer that. But we haven't actually quantified that yet.
Okay, so what you're saying is that there's basically a record of that trade.
It's not a record of the trade. You have observed the pattern that might reflect some of those, under the table trade happening.
Okay, thank you.
This is a bit of a very grounded question, but what is the legal or formal definition of lobbying? And I'm curious how comprehensive a data set like this would be for lobbying type efforts, or if, given the constraints implied by like the language of the law, everything that we might think of as labeling is covered by these reporting mechanisms.
Thanks. So based on the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995, the lobbying is defined in terms of lobbyists spending their time. So if you are spending I forgot the exact number, but let's say that 50% or more of your time representing interest of your client, then that is defined as a lobbying activity. And then if your lobbying activity satisfies that definition, then you're legally required to file a quarterly, the 4 times a year report describing your lobbying activities. That said, that that definition does not fully cover all the other, let's say the 5% use of your time representing your client interests might not satisfy the definition. And therefore, it's true that there are a lot of other lobbying activities that are not being measured. So there will be the cases like that. But from researchers' perspective, that one is we cannot really measure. Right? So what we are doing is to start with this lobbying activity based on the legal definition of the lobbying, and then try to capture the universal lobbying from that perspective. And the government auditing agency frequently audit the behavior of individual interest groups' lobbying activity. The last time that I saw the report, their report says that 97% of their targeted investigation has shown that 97% of interest groups have properly reported their lobbying activity based on the definition of the law.
Further questions?
Thanks. This is sort of a two-part question, but I am curious. It seemed like you're not really able necessarily to identify the client in all cases, but I'm wondering, do patterns emerge where certain lobbyists tend to represent certain types of clients or certain types of causes or certain types of political movements or perspectives?
Yes, but I don't know what made you think that we do not.
I might have just stepped away when you shared that.
Yeah, we do observe the clients' individual lobbying activities, and we do observe their position taking for individual bills. Maybe it would be an interesting example that I prepared. So the drug sentencing is perhaps the most egregious example of systematic discrimination in American policymaking. Do you know about this story about powder cocaine versus crack cocaine? It turned out that there is like 100-to-1 ratio in punishment differences, where the crack cocaine users will be 100 times more punished. And then it turned out that although the white and black Americans use drugs at the comparable rates, the crack cocaine users are overwhelmingly black, and powder cocaine users are overwhelmingly white. And what we were able to do is to look at this particular legislation in 2009, House Bill number 3425, and then see, in this case, the left-hand side is NAACP, and the right-hand side is the lobbying by FOP, right? And then, given the lobbying activities, we were able to measure whether one is a support and the other is opposed. And then we were able to see that those who has opposed won in that the actual lawmaking reflected their interest. So we can go this far. In individual bill, we know the universe of the interest groups, at least based on the definition of lobbying, who oppose and support it, how they're distributed, how they organize their lobbying activities differently in terms of the timing of the lobbying, like a later part or beginning part. And then for those bills that have been actually voted on the floor and then passed into a law, we'll be able to also systematically measure whose interests were either disproportionately or proportionally represented in the lawmaking.
Yeah, my questions are probably a little afield from what you talked about, but there's a lot of, or a number of things in legislation for economic bills where it's worded in obscure ways that are pretty hard to figure out what's going on, but designed to benefit a single firm.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if that's something you've looked into and can recognize when things look like they might be benefiting a single firm.
Yes. So what we have done is for each individual bill, we know who's lobbied, right? So we counted the number of interest groups that have lobbied on any given bill. If you give me a random bill, and then we are going to count the number of all interest groups that have on that particular bill, what do you think it is the median number? For any given bill, we're going to count the number of interest groups that have lobbied on a given bill. That's a very aggressive prediction. The median number is 2. Often, the one is a subsidiary of the other. So the point that I'm trying to make is you're exactly right. There are all these micro bills that are representing the interests of a very, very small number of interest groups. And if you interview a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., everyone knows that, oh, this bill is an Apple bill, this bill is a Google bill. We just don't know because there's just one sentence says that, oh, if a company uses this technology A, then revenue generated by that technology A will be tax exempt. And it turned out that there's only one company in the world that uses technology A. Then that particular line in the legislation could be seen as a private good of that particular interest group. And our goal is to try to create a connection between that micro bills and then individual interest groups' interest.